Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 21st of March 2024. Well, not before we go to the normal geopolitical stuff. This is geopolitical discussion that I will be having, but it's in a direct answer to a request from a viewer that says, I'm worried about reports of France planning to send forces into Ukraine and footage of the US equipment in Greece. Reports of general mobilization in Russia, or near to, seems we're heading to World War III. Can you do a video on these reports and validate or explain these reports? So I'm going to devote a little bit of time to that at the beginning of this, because I think it is important. I do think we are in World War III to a degree. I did a separate video on that recently where I was like, this is really serious, and I don't think people understand how serious it is. I think there are elements of European nations. Well, the EU, I think, does really understand this, and that's why we're seeing a general move towards a war footing. But that is being mitigated by the efforts of Russia with the disinformation campaigns and the fomenting of discord in European nations, particularly in non-EU nations in the Balkans, but also Slovakia and Hungary. Obviously, we know about Hungary and Viktor Orban, but also Slovakia. Robert Fico is the prime minister, and there's a new presidential election coming up where we know that they're going to be really fighting hard, the Russians, to make sure that their pro-Russian candidate gets in and replaces the presently pro-EU, pro-Western president, who is different from the prime minister, obviously, in Slovakia. So there are issues there that are going to be operating, but also, and be very wary about this. And I know I have French viewers, and some of you French viewers are fine with the National Rally, the French far right party that used to be the Front National of Marine Le Pen and previously her father. That they have connections to Russia, but here's the worry. So let me explain what my position is. I am pro-EU. I think it absolutely has to maintain in order to best defeat the threat of Russia. We need European unity, both in sort of each country bilaterally supporting Ukraine, but also the EU and unity within the EU. What Putin has wanted for a long time. So he was for Brexit. I said this in 2016. I said it to my parents who are arch Brexiteers. I said it to anyone who cared to listen, that look who really wants Brexit to happen. Putin wants it to happen, right? He wants European disunity more, I think, than he wants American disunity. And he really wants that. Okay, so the EU is the bigger threat to Putin due to the economic ties with Europe with regard to hydrocarbons and trade, which is much more prevalent than the American economic interaction with Russia, and its geographical position right next to Russia. So the EU is enemy number one for Putin. He wants to undo the EU, and he's been trying for a quite long time to do that. Brexit, and I've wrote an article talking about how so many political movements at the moment on the extremes in Europe can be explained in light of Russian influence. One of them is France and Marine Le Pen's National Rally, and there are European elections coming up in France, and Macron is not looking in a good position to do well there, or at least his party. Now, I've been praising Macron a lot recently because of his positioning on Ukraine, but there's absolutely no doubt that domestically within France, and you look at the protests of the farmers, there is discord, and National Rally are looking to capitalize on that, and they will do really successfully in the European elections. Now, here's a problem. You may be anti-EU for whatever reason, or you may be a Brexiteer if you're British, but if the EU falls apart or cracks form in the EU, that is not good for global security. That is only good for Russia, is my general thesis. And so when the European elections in France are looking like you'll get a success for an anti-EU, a strongly Eurosceptic party doing well on the back of a lack of domestic support for Macron, this is a massive problem. So we are in an information war at the moment. We're in a cyber war. France has been attacked with cyber warfare. The hospitals have been attacked recently. World War III is taking place, but it's taking place all across the world in dimensions that aren't just kind of tanks against guns and battlefields and drones and whatnot. So we need to be putting things in place, and this will actually segue on to what I'm next going to talk about. But we need to be putting things in place to ensure that NATO, the EU, the West are in a strong position industrially and politically and geopolitically to rebut the attempts of Russia. So then that's a kind of World War III part of this. Mobilization will happen, and that is what we need to be preparing for. And I think that's why NATO and the EU, I'm going to leave out America here because of the weird impasse in Congress, but my goodness, if Reagan was in charge, America would be freaking doing all sorts of stuff now. Because there is no doubt in my mind that Russia will have some kind of mobilization coming up. And that's when the excrement hits the fan. Because there's going to be a huge onset of people, boots on the ground, coming to Russia. The good thing for Ukraine is that there isn't enough equipment for them. So that's what is going to hamstring possibly the Russians, but there's certainly potential for them to throw, I think potential and will for them to throw lots of boots at the problem, and that will step things up. So what else is happening here? Well, France is maybe getting a little bit angsty about this. So we have Macron saying we're not going to rule out troops on the ground. And then we had these claims coming from TASS, basically. And, well, let's read through this. So the Moscow Times, which is an exiled Russian newspaper here, says Russian spy chief claims France is planning to send 2,000 soldiers to Ukraine. Russia has intelligence that France is gearing up to send 2,000 of its soldiers to Ukraine. The head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR, Sergei Narishkin, has said on Tuesday the French soldiers will become a legitimate priority target for attacks by the Russian armed forces. He said, according to a statement published on the SVR's website, the sword awaits all Frenchmen who enter the territory of the Russian world. This is the Ruski Mir. Because, of course, Ukraine is part of that. Narishkin's uncorroborated claims came on the same day that General Pierre Schill, Chief of Staff of the French Land Forces, said the French army stood ready for the toughest engagements. Schill did not specifically refer to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the risk of the conflict spreading, but he did say, quote, the sources of crisis are multiplying and carry with them risks of spiralling or extending. And, of course, this is on the back of Emmanuel Macron saying what he was up for, which is not ruling out French troops on the ground. Schill, the Frenchman, said France could assemble a division of 20,000 troops in a coalition within 30 days and command an army of around 60,000 soldiers by joining other allied nations. The French army says it has 121,000 soldiers and can call up 24,000 reservists. Narishkin claimed that 2,000 French troops will be deployed into Ukraine in the initial stage of a wider mission. The French military fears that such a large unit would not be able to be transferred and stationed in Ukraine unnoticed, he said, without elaborating. So this is, I would say, information warfare coming from the Russians here. They are trying to ramp things up to maybe justify their own mobilization, a lot more to their public, but also there's going to be, I don't know how they see this going, but there are all these chess moves that are taking place, so that they're trying to predict what other nations will do, and then trying to say things themselves that will stop other nations doing that. So maybe this will make the French public go up in arms. So, oh my God, we was going to send 2,000 troops, and it cause a massive outcry. And so in the end, French officials have to come out and say, no, we're not doing that. No, we're not doing that. And maybe that works in favor of Russia. So Russia doing this kind of amplifies the domestic political discord in France. Okay, so that could be part of it. But there's no doubt to me that nations such as France and probably the UK and probably the US, even given the impasse in Congress, other nations will be putting preparations in place so that they're not caught off guard. There will be wargaming taking place. Well, if this happens, we need to be prepared to do that. So it may be that politicians have said, yeah, we're not looking at sending troops. Even like Germans saying that, and other nations in Europe saying, yeah, we're not up for sending troops. But even those nations are going to be putting plans in place. oh my goodness, in case something does happen, right, if we got this ready, I want a readiness report from you guys. I want to know what would happen if this happens. There will be plans going on and wargaming. So that that kind of those plans and wargamings will involve things moving around, practices happening, um, drills, military engagements in training that may then filter through into the public domain as this nation is mobilizing towards sending troops to Ukraine. And of course, it's not quite what's going on. They're just planning for eventualities and changing things up. And anyway, this can translate into French TV discussing hypothetical sending of French troops to Ukraine. Could you imagine such stories like this happening previously? No, but now on French TV, you've got retired generals or whatever talking about, well, actually, we'll send troops down and we'll go to this part of Ukraine, and it will be all about the Dnipro River. All of it, fairly sensible, but it's quite catchy TV, and the news channel is going to love that. It might freak people out and think, well, oh my goodness, this means we're actually sending troops, but it's highly unlikely the case. I find it very interesting that Odessa keeps being mentioned, and this is apparently from sort of, I don't know, it's leaks, but when Macron had been talking about stuff before, Odessa was a place that was almost the red line concerning French troops. And I think this is a realization that if Russia does take that land bridge all the way to Transnistria, then Ukraine has absolutely no access to the Black Sea. And that also has huge ramifications for NATO, for Ukraine going forward in terms of its own sustainability, economic sustainability, so on and so forth. And then that affects food, trade, and sort of grain supply to the world, etc., etc. So that's why I think Odessa becomes a bit of a red line for someone like Macron, and as it should do, I think, for many people. So I think the French will be preparing stuff. I don't think that they are actually sending 2,000 troops. I think that is Russian psyops for sure. But it's quite funny because, well, it's not funny. Nothing's funny here. But there are like these memes like Macron just this pro-Ukrainian fella here saying, as a British citizen, I just want to say that if France sends troops to Ukraine, we should send troops to Ukraine. If they ride, we ride. It's practically tradition at this point. Can't let the French have a tear up on the continent without us by their side. Of course, this is being frivolous with the whole notion of sending troops to war and death and destruction. So we must be careful about that. But the response to this is coming from the Guardian's live feed. France's defense ministry called remarks by the chief of Russia's foreign intelligence service disinformation and irresponsible after he suggested Paris was preparing to send 2,000 troops to Ukraine. Sergei Narishkin, director of Russian foreign intelligence, was quoted by the Russian state news agency TASS as saying France was preparing to send 2,000 troops to Ukraine, and that French troops would be a legitimate target for the Russian forces if they ever come to the territory of the Russian world with a sword. Okay, so as mentioned, so the French have rebutted that, but I'm fairly sure they'll be as I stated, preparing things. Now, the other element of this is footage of US equipment in Greece. Now, I'm not 100% sure exactly what this is equipment, who it's for. There is lots of reports came from this Greek City Times piece. The Greek City Times piece has virtually nothing, and it's almost like it's missing a paragraph. It said the statement, doesn't talk about what statement. Anyway, a large cargo ship has turned up in Alexandroupolis and offloaded a bunch of Bradleys and Abrams. Not a phenomenal amount, mind, but an amount that's got people going, oh my goodness, there's equipment in Greece, US equipment. Greek media reported that the port of Alexandroupolis was overflowing with dozens of Bradley, but I don't know that you can overflow with dozens. It's like 24, 48. Infantry fighting vehicles and Abrams tanks intended to strengthen NATO in Europe. So, it's highly unlikely that these vehicles are supposed to be for Ukraine. Now, what's just happened recently? Well, the Greeks have said, right, we're giving a whole bunch of equipment to Ukraine. I think with some arm twisting from the US, all that Soviet equipment going, the US said, well, we're not going to give that, we're not going to give you or sell you F-35s until this happens. So that happened, then you're going to get F-35s coming to Greece, I would have thought. And it could be that this equipment's part of that, I don't know. Or that, as mentioned here, strengthening NATO. It's just one of the ports in Europe and further to the east of Europe, so more useful for that whole Eastern Front. You can't fly these things in, so these would have been set sail some time ago. They eventually arrive in Greece, and they could be on their way up to Romania, up to Poland, Germany. This is not crazy unusual. So I don't know that this is anything that is particularly like eyebrow raising, other than NATO is strengthening forces within Europe. I mean, that is what is happening, and there's been lots of talk about that. So, on the one hand, we are kind of involved in World War III, is my opinion, in many different dimensions, and Russia are ramping up potentially with a mobilization. Europe are ramping up in terms of production to try and get onto a war footing to match Russia's industrial war footing. You've got this kind of escalation happening, but on the other hand, I don't think France is going to be sending 2,000 troops tomorrow to Ukraine, and I don't think this equipment is due to be plopped into Ukraine and told the Ukrainians told to get on and use it against the Russians. So, but then we have NATO may soon take on more responsibility for organising aid to Ukraine as fears grow over the implications for the military alliance if Donald Trump were to return to the White House. So, is again, I don't want to be always talking about Donald Trump, but this is what the rest of the world is talking about, and people at NATO and other politicians are consistently talking about, okay, what happens in November if Trump wins, and if Trump wins, what does that mean with regard to US support for Ukraine? So he's already said via Viktor Orban that the US will not spend a penny of their money on Ukraine. So that's what people are worried about. You might be the biggest Trump fan out there, but if we're to believe Viktor Orban, and that's backed up by what Trump's sons have said, by what Trump himself has previously said, and by all the things we know about Trump and everything he's previously said, it's almost certain that would be what his desire would be. Whether he can get over Congress and the Department of Defense individuals and strategies to make that a reality, I don't know. But the scoop here is that NATO, and this comes from Semaphore, NATO may soon take on more responsibility in providing aid to Ukraine as fears grow over the implications of military alliance if ex-President Donald Trump were to return to the White House. The organisation's headquarters is leading talks aimed at taking some of the coordination of Western military aid to Ukraine from the Pentagon and transferring it to NATO. So I don't know, there is very little detail about what that actually means, but I would suggest that this is a way of the US giving aid to Ukraine without giving aid to Ukraine. So, like, by being able to do stuff under the umbrella of NATO, like the Pentagon saying, right, we're going to move these troops here and we're going to do this, and then NATO ends up being able to use American resources to do X, Y, and Z. I don't know. I don't know what that would look like. There are no details here, just these vague generalities, but I think that could be a way, because I've said to you before, the US will be looking at all the ways they can help Ukraine without sending them aid packages. So if Congress aren't going to give an aid package, the Department of Defense is going to be going, right, okay, we're up shit creek without a paddle. What other paddles can we make? Like we need to get this boat moving, and we need paddles. You guys go and work out what you can do over there. You guys work out what you can do with Greece. You guys work out what you can do. We're going to do some Bradleys to Morocco so that Morocco can get some T-72s over there. Right, let's help Ukraine in all these other ways. And, we're going to have a go at India. You're not going to take on Russian hydrocarbons. We're going to be tough on sanctions there. We need to help Ukraine win without giving a massive $60 billion aid package. So this could be part of that. NATO is aiming to conclude the discussion by July when the bloc holds its annual summit, which will be held in Washington, D.C. this year. It's unclear when, if at all, the tasks would be shifted across the Atlantic. And this is coming from 3 Western officials with knowledge of the discussions, speaking on conditions of anonymity, because they're not permitted to release details of the talk. So, okay, anonymous sources and all that. Negotiations are partly driven by fears of Trump's return to office. European officials vividly recall Trump's prior term, during which he repeatedly questioned NATO's value. Since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Trump has said, were he in office, he would end the conflict within 24 hours without offering details, but analysts have suggested he would be more amenable to concessions of Ukrainian territory than US President Joe Biden. After a recent meeting with Trump, Hungarian Prime Minister Orban said the former president will not give a penny to Kyiv if elected. A spokesperson for NATO did not respond to requests for a comment, obviously. But yeah, there's been talk about how to coordinate a robust setup to protect the aid and donations to Ukraine from changing political winds, the diplomat said. Another put it thus: a NATOification of the support for Ukraine is emerging. So it's exactly what I was just talking about previously. I hadn't read this part of the article. In an interview, Finland's foreign minister said, "We need to organise all the support that we can give to Ukraine, and I think that NATO is very well suited to do that. So we also support initiatives in this regard." There are certain things that only we can do, said Eric Chiaramella, a former acting senior director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council, told Semaphore, referring to military logistics, capabilities and planning. But when it comes to organising the summit-type meetings, certainly there are plenty of examples where the Europeans have run with that. So you've got NATO starting to build up support and build up, organisational structures and logistics for support of Ukraine. Now, Jay in Kiev, admittedly, an American who's very pro-Ukraine, he's in Kiev. He lives in Ukraine at the moment. Says he said, "I spoke with a 3-star US general today, and this quote is sticking with me." Take it with a pinch of salt and all that. America hasn't just screwed the brave Ukrainians, but also the other Europeans that now unexpectedly have to go it alone, even possibly sending troops to compensate for US political dysfunction. When America needs allies, and we will, it's now a question as to how much support there will be. So it's the idea, supposedly coming from an American 3-star general, that actually, if we're not supporting Europe here and our really closest allies that we've been chivying along for the last 70 years, and then suddenly that they need us to help them, we're not helping, then when we need their aid, when we try our next, I don't know, Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, thing that the Americans take the lead on, what support will they get from allied nations, from otherwise allied nations? And yeah, it's an open question now. So talking about, just to remain a little bit on Trump here. So as you will know, he's up for sort of $500 million, in what he owes to the courts. Otherwise, they're going to start repossessing his properties and whatnot. And the first bond was put up by Chubb, which is an insurance company that has strong connections to Trump world, right? I won't go into the whole details about it, but anyway, they are, there is no surprise that Chubb supported or put up that $90 million bond. However, no one's put up the next $400 million part of what he owes, and so there's a bit of an issue there. But Andrew Wiseman has said 90 million down, 400 million to go, and the public has no idea who may have actually put up the money or provided a guarantee to support the bond. But one thing's sure, Trump is beholden to someone for a lot of money. Hey Andrew, did you know the current CEO of Chubb, who footed the $90 million bill, sits on the board of the Center for National Interest, which you and your team investigated as part of Russia's attempts to compromise the 2016 Trump campaign? Seems important. In other words, the CEO of Chubb, who has put up this bond so far, the first bond and a massive bond for Trump so that he can appeal that, has connections to or sits on the board of an organisation that was investigated over Russia's influence in the US elections. Again, Russia seems to be there, even at the heart of the bond for Donald Trump. It's just incredible. Russia's return on investments, I think, are incredible. Say what you like about Russia. What they've done in international politics for the kind of the size and the power of the nation, which I think is overstated, as we can see from like what they've done with this war, which is not a very good job. They have done amazing things in the information space and with influence, peddling their wares around the world and getting influence in so many countries. It's incredible. Right, negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU should start by the end of June, according to their Prime Minister. Quote, for our part, we have done everything to ensure that the negotiation process starts no later than June. We are waiting for a decision from the partners. There is positive optimism about this, said the Prime Minister. That's moving along quite briskly. Despite the war in Ukraine, France continues to buy large quantities of uranium from the state company Rosatom. So that's a Russian atomic state entity. Can we claim to support Kyiv while paying several hundred million euros per year to our enemy? MPs are calling for an end to this. And here's the problem, and I'm not going to massively criticise France because I haven't done this in all the other instances that this has happened with. It's just really difficult, and it's why Rosatom has not yet been sanctioned, because you sanction Rosatom and they are servicing and have built, service and would decommission many nuclear facilities around Europe. Hungary is a particular example. Then it becomes a massive health risk to the world, right? So you can't just say, right, we're sanctioning Rosatom, no one's going to have anything to do with them, and then suddenly you've got a nuclear reactor blowing up that affects everyone, right? So it's really difficult. And the same with the hydrocarbons. You can't just say, right, we're stopping oil and gas right now, and we're going to get oil and gas somewhere else, because that takes years of logistics and sorting out. And okay, so we're not going to use this gas pipeline. Well, then what? How else are we going to, like, that took 10 years to build. How are we suddenly going to get this from somewhere else? So you've got to expect things to be slow. And even if you hate what Russia do, there's still a necessity to get uranium. Now, you can get uranium from other places. Australia is a great example. And what's interesting, I think they have cut it down. It's now, I think, a quarter of France's uranium comes from Africa and the Sahel region. Now, as you notice, there's been, 7 coups in that region of all former French colonies and whatnot, moving towards Russia. And so France are in a difficult position where they've got a massive nuclear energy industry, like huge compared to many other nations proportionally. And they're going to need their uranium. I'm no expert, but I would expect them to continue doing this until they can secure safe uranium from elsewhere. That's the sort of thing that isn't easy to do. It's not like everyone sells uranium, right? And everyone has uranium deposits in their country. So there's a relatively small number of countries that can do that. We'll see where that goes, but I don't blame France. They're not talking out both sides of their mouth. It's like, we're really strong against Russia, but we have no choice at the moment, I assume, on uranium. But I also assume that will change over time. A few more statements from Sullivan. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has been in Kyiv. USA believes in Ukraine. Ukraine should believe in the USA. Biden fights for money for Ukraine every day. And that doesn't surprise me. I think the White House knows how serious this is. Russia, of course they do. Russia has already been defeated, he says. Interesting. US presidential administration is not yet ready to announce the supply of ATACMS. I don't know if that means he stated that explicitly, as in we're not ready to, or whether he didn't say anything about them, and therefore the implication is they're not ready to discuss them, but they may be sending them. I reckon the US, if they were giving a $60 billion package, if that got through right now, I think ATACMS and an awful lot of stuff will be on there now. We're 6 months down the line from there, and things have changed, and red lines have been crossed, and nothing's happened. And so I think the US would be like, yeah, you want these? We'll give you a bunch of these. But that's just my supposition there. EU summit will not approve the confiscation of income from Russian assets because of the position of Hungary. And this is the idea that 90% of the frozen assets money that's going to be given to Ukraine will be spent on buying equipment, military equipment for Ukraine. 10% will be invested into the Ukrainian defense industry. While you've got Viktor Orban, who is Mr. Putin in the EU, saying, that ain't happening. And that's Viktor Orban being Viktor Orban, being almost swore. So what a difference here. Dispensing with the compensatory golden chariots required by the likes of Putin, Putin and Trump, the Czech president walks home after a long day of securing democracy. Here is Petr Pavel, just like, oh, I'm going to walk home. It's that time. I've just secured another 500,000 shells. I'm just going to go home for a bite to eat, and then I might go down a pub. Just like quite nice. It's the president of the Czechia just having a stroll home, whereas other people will be in similar positions, and other countries will be, chauffeur driven with high detailed security. So I don't know. Maybe she's walking across an inner courtyard. UN here. According to Kyiv Independent, Russia is creating a stifling climate of fear in occupied territories. So Russia is committing widespread violations of international law to create a stifling climate of fear in occupied parts of Ukraine, according to UN. Quote, the actions of the Russian Federation have ruptured the social fabric of communities and left individuals isolated, with profound and long-lasting consequences for Ukrainian society as a whole, said the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. I've just done a live with Talaria. Please go and watch it, where we talked about, she expressed in very detailed way, in a very organized fashion, how how Russia aren't even in the UN. They don't actually have membership of the UN. They can't even be kicked out of it because they're not in it. And they shouldn't be on the Security Council because they're not in the UN. And actually, really good video that's an absolute closed. The case is closed. It's like done and dusted. They just need to be challenged on that. But actually, yeah, Russia are not in the UN, so they shouldn't be vetoing X, Y, and Z because they're not even on the Security Council. Anyway, go and watch that. It is really good. So, that's a bit of a sidebar there. Okay, Russian media is reporting that several Chinese banks have stopped accepting yuan payments from Russia. That's very important. Several Chinese banks have stopped accepting payments from Russia in Chinese yuan, fearing ramifications of US sanctions. The Russian state-controlled outlet Izvestia reported on the 21st, citing representatives of the Russian banking sector and business. These institutions include Ping An Bank, Bank of Ningbo, China Guangfa Bank, Kanshan Rural Commercial Bank, Great Wall West China Bank, Shenzhen Rural Commercial Bank, etc., etc., etc. Lots of other banks. Said Alexei Poroshin, the director of Pervaya Group of firm. Now, we're seeing this a little bit where Chinese and Indian behaviour is being somewhat changed because of worries over international sanctions, and this will be largely to do with the US. And this is fantastic. You need Russia to really hurt in a pocket in order that there's so much discomfort in Russia that something's forced to be changed. Hopefully, the leader. This feeds into, well, no, actually, it doesn't feed into just the whole nature of how close we are to World War III, or the fact that as I say, that we're already in it. It's not made any better by US foreign policy increasingly frozen by a few MAGA politicians that were guided into office by Russian propaganda machine. Every enemy of Western democracy is taking what they can, says Jay Kiev. Again, you know what he's like on that kind of subject matter. But the idea is Bloomberg reporting that China is on track to be ready for Taiwan invasion by 2027, according to the US. The idea that as is still prevalent in parts of American discourse, that the US needs to stop supporting Ukraine because China's the bigger topic, the bigger threat, and so actually the US should be supporting Taiwan. Well, actually, that bill included Taiwan aid, and that's not got through. And also, China are just looking at what's going on in Ukraine, and at the moment they're sitting back and laughing at the fact that for 6 months the US has been unable to do anything. They're like, well, let's invade Taiwan then. Might as well go for it. So looking at a 2027 invasion there, and US is apparently onto that. It's just a ramping up of an escalation of the global conflict that is taking place at the moment. Anyway, as I was just talking about China's behavior changing in certain aspects, India's largest energy company has refused to supply Russian oil by sea. According to Reuters, India's Reliance has refused to deliver Urals crude by Sovcomflot tankers because of the threat of failing falling under secondary US sanctions. The operator of the world's largest oil refining complex, according to the agency, demanded to refuse delivery of new shipments of Sovcomflot tankers. The Russian state-owned shipping company was placed on the US sanctions list in February. The development makes it even more difficult for Russia to export oil, as its oil companies may face difficulties in finding ships to transport it, the agency said. And that's obviously all good news for hurting Russia in the pocket so that they can't fund the continued prosecution of the war in Ukraine. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you very much for listening. It was a big one today. There was a lot to talk about. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.